So, hey guys, welcome to a new movie review. Today I'm going to be talking about a David Lynch film from the 1980s that was also an adaptation of a very famous Frank Herbert sci-fi novel from the early or the mid 60s, I would say. Um, this film took forever to get off the ground back in the day. We even have a remake coming in 2020 from director Denis Villeneuve of Blade Runner 2049 and Sicario fame. But back in 1984, David Lynch was assigned with the film Dune. This, like I said, is based on the Frank Herbert novel of the same name. This film has a lot of cult following, but a lot of people who really don't like it. Um, this definitely is a review for me where I personally did not like it. So let's talk about Dune, why there was a lot of anticipation behind it, but at the same time, why it kind of doesn't work as a film. I'm sure it's an amazing novel. I've never personally read it, but as a film, this movie kind of doesn't work. So in this movie, Dune, you guys, it's about a young prince named Paul Atreides, and he lives in a sand planet of sorts called Dune, or there's some more specific term for it that the film explains at one point. And his planet is in charge of a element called the spice, and you can find it all over the desert on this planet. And all these other planets across the galaxy want this element. It can help you live longer. It can help you look sharper. It can help you see. It can keep your vision intact longer, and all this stuff that makes people just want it like crazy. And like I said, every planet across the galaxy wants this stuff. But it becomes a point where the sand supply of this spice starts to get limited. That the production value and the way that it's produced isn't as successful as it once was, which is making people afraid that they can't get a hold of this spice any longer after a while. So after a series of events, Paul Atreides, this young prince, is assigned of leading a bunch of royal followers to basically protect the spice, go to war with the people that are willing to go to war for it because they want it that badly, and make sure the spice doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Or at least that's the very simplified synopsis of this movie that I can get out of this movie based off the film that I saw anyway. So in this movie, guys, Dune, there's things about it that work, but there's things about it that really, really do not work. I guess to start, I am a David Lynch fan. I liked a lot of his films. I like Blue Velvet. To a degree, I like Eraserhead. It's an interesting film, even though there's a lot of things in that film that don't necessarily work. I love Mulholland Drive. It's probably my favorite David Lynch film. Inland Empire was all right. The Straight Story was all right. He's definitely had some clunkers. But I think Mulholland Drive and Blue Velvet are kind of good examples of films of his that kind of display what his powers can do for a film when handled correctly. And he's very good at handling surreal imagery when he's given the right script and all that good stuff. But in Dune, you guys, because this is a narrative story, it is based off of a book from someone else's work. It was kind of David Lynch's responsibility to translate that story into the screen in all the right ways, but I don't think that really happened here. I think his surreal imagery was helpful on certain moments. There's certain moments where his visual touch can make a Dune film potentially good, but I don't think he translated this book into the screen in the right way necessarily. So for the positives and negatives of this film, I guess to kind of list off a couple good things I can say about the movie, I do think the set designs are very nice. I think whoever his set designer was, whether that was David Lynch's choice or the person he just assigned correctly to that task, I thought the set designs were great. I thought they looked nice. They helped the cinematography make the film look good where it could. The deserts looked great. They looked like they were big and kind of lasted forever, and that if you were in this desert, it would take you days to get across it and things like that. So as far as how the film looks and its set designs, I think those are very good. I thought that part of the film was handled very well. And I do think Dune has a neat sci-fi concept of this young prince, tragic events happen, he has to protect this element from other planets that is very valuable, and if it gets into the wrong hands, there could be disastrous results in the galaxy. This Dune basically had the potential to be the next Star Wars, because this came out in 1984, a year after Return of the Jedi, which ironically enough David Lynch turned down to do this movie. Um, this film had the potential to be the next Star Wars, really. I mean, the books were successful, people loved them, this film was anticipated. Um, it just kind of failed. And I think the sci fi concept is really cool. I'm sure the book gives that concept more justice than this film did. Um, cool sci fi concept, the whole thing about guarding a powerful element could be a good story. Unfortunately, this film doesn't use that concept to its fullest potential, but I think it is a neat sci-fi concept regardless. So hopefully the 2020 film could do that justice on film better. The occasional use of surreal imagery that David Lynch is known for, I think when David Lynch's special touch to Dune happens, I think those scenes are good. I think they're effective. I think they're definitely why he was hired to do this film to begin with. There's a lot of like worm imagery and like worms floating in space and worms roaming deserts and things like that. I think that stuff is definitely up David Lynch's alley for what he can do for a film. So I thought when those scenes happen and it's just about the surreal imagery, I think Dune works on that level. There's also a lot of early starts for famous celebrities who were not very well known at the time, but they became famous after this movie, particular for other films that they got involved with after this movie. Some examples are Virginia Madsen, who later got famous for Sideways, which was nominated for Academy Awards. Brad Dourif had a role in this film. He's known for the voice of Chucky in the Child's Play films, which also came after the Dune movie. Patrick Stewart was involved with this movie. You know, obviously he got involved with Star Trek and American Dad and all the stuff that we don't know and love him for. Kyle MacLachlan, who plays Paul Atreides himself in this movie, the main character. He obviously went on to do like the Flintstones and Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet and other things that were successful both from him and from David Lynch. Unfortunately, this wasn't the right movie for that to happen, but a lot of famous starts for a lot of famous people who eventually got famous for other things. I also do appreciate David Lynch's attempt to make something that wasn't necessarily his cup of tea at the time, which was a non-surreal story into a film. Yes, there's surreal moments and his special touch and everything throughout the movie, but for the most part, he had to make a film that wasn't really meant to be surreal. And basically adapt a story that's loved by many from a book, turn it into a film. Obviously, he did wonders for Elephant Man with his surreal imagery and bringing a real story that happened into the film. But I think with Dune, I don't think that happened as successfully this time around, unfortunately. I think that Elephant Man was a better fit for David Lynch, but the whole thing with making a non-surreal story into a film with surreal elements, nice attempt. I like that part of his effort in this movie, but the fact that it didn't translate as well as the part where I can't give him as much credit for. Now, for my negatives of Dune, and I unfortunately have a lot of them, I think the characterizations of this film are very, very poor. Paul Atreides doesn't get past being just the prince. His father doesn't get past just being the king of the story. His mother doesn't get past just being the queen. His sister doesn't get past being the sister. There's just really not specific characterizations about these characters that make them developed, make them grow, make them better people throughout the film. So by the time the film's over with, I really can't care about anybody because the characterizations of all the characters haven't really been all that good to begin with. There's one thing that was very odd in this movie, and I don't know if this is David Lynch literally bringing the page to the screen for this movie for adapting it. Whenever a character had a voiceover, which in a book you can just write like so and so thought this in their head, the character would whisper it as a voiceover, and that was supposed to be them thinking about something rather than telling another character on the screen what they were thinking. So I thought that was a very odd choice, and once again proof that this is a very literal adaptation, probably. So I thought the whole whispered voiceover thought thing did not work in this movie. I also think the overall story and the overall setup for this film was very poor, and the overall journey that we take in this movie is very lackluster. The setup takes forever to get going. It takes the film over an hour to properly get set up for where it's going to go. And then once we're on this journey in this movie, it's just very lackluster and just not worth the journey. I also thought a lot of characters didn't display a lot of emotion in this movie. It was a very straightforward dialogue. They literally talk like this throughout the whole movie, and this is how they talk to characters, and this is how they respond, and this is the emotion they express, and this is how they talk to the camera. It just kind of had that feeling to me. Yes, there's moments where Kyle MacLachlan is talking to his dad in the heavens, or he's expressing his love to a woman that he really likes, or whatever. But for the most part, this film lacks emotion. It just really is just kind of straightforward dialogue. And even the opening scene with Virginia Madsen kind of explaining about this world that this film takes place in, it's a very straightforward narrative that they don't really kind of need her on the front of the camera to tell us. She could have just done that as a voiceover. So I just thought this film lacked emotion, and it was a very uninvolving film as a result. I also thought the story pacing was very bad in this movie. I thought this film had no idea how to be paced. It had way too many scenes where it's just characters talking to each other about nothing really. There's just a lot of scenes where characters are walking in the desert rather than battling in the desert. It just had a very bad sense of pacing, and I really wish the film could have picked up the pace after a while, because this is a 2.5 hour film, and it feels very long at 2.5 hours. Overall, I thought this film needed more explanation too. There's just so many things about the story where I don't understand certain things about certain characters. There's certain things in this universe that really don't make sense on film. So I don't know if the book does a better job explaining all this, but the film really needed more explanation at more moments throughout the runtime. There's also some characters, for the most part, who are pretty worthless to the story. I don't know how significant they were in the book, but for example, Patrick Stewart is basically just a character to support the prince. Brad Dourif is just a character who helps support the villain and makes the villain look even worse throughout the movie and things like that. There's just a lot of characters in this film that I really didn't understand what they exactly did for the story. So whether the book did this more justice for these characters or not, I don't really know. But on film, I thought a lot of these characters, for the most part, were pretty worthless. So overall, I'm going to give Dune, from the 1984 adaptation of the film from David Lynch, I'm going to give Dune a 6 out of 10. There's some good things in it. There's good flavors of a potentially good film here, but there's just a lot of bad things in it, like bad characterization, the weird voiceover thought thing, a poor setup, a lackluster journey, a lack of emotion, bad story pacing. It needed more explanation throughout almost the whole film, really. And there was just a lot of characters that, for me personally, were pretty worthless throughout the film. So 6 out of 10 for me. I wouldn't recommend seeing Dune. Only see it if you're a really hardcore fan of the book, or if you really just want to see kind of what David Lynch tried at one point and kind of didn't do so well at. So I think he's better off at making surreal stories that are kind of his own tale. Unfortunately, adapting a really big book like Dune, I don't think was the right choice for him, unfortunately. 6 out of 10 for me. I can't recommend Dune.